Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson. Welcome to tonight's show, Lincoln's Final Days in Springfield. On the morning of February 11th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln looked out upon many of his rain-soaked Springfield friends and neighbors from the back of a train car. He gave a brief, emotional speech and then departed for Washington, D.C. He would not live to see Springfield again. The story of the days leading up to that final Springfield speech have been told many times over the years, yet even with all that has been written, there are still interesting details about the time period that may be clarified or explained to or explored to a greater degree. Scott T. Schroeder is a professional healthcare practitioner and an independent historian focusing on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era. He speaks regularly on those topics and is actively involved in research and manuscript preparation for articles and book projects. He has led tours of Lincoln-related sites and is involved in the development and or co-development of various multimedia projects related to the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Schroeder serves on the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Association, the board of advisors for the Lincoln Forum, the board of directors for the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and the board of directors for the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. For more information about our Looking for Lincoln conversations, you can visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. It's now my pleasure to introduce Scott Schroeder.
Hi, Sarah. Hello, everybody out there. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. As Sarah mentioned in the talk description, my talk tonight is about Lincoln's last days in Springfield prior to leaving for Washington, D.C. But of course, that story has been told many times over. I just want to tell you a little bit about the generation of where this talk came from and why I'm wanting to bring out some specific things tonight. So several years ago, a friend of mine, Brian Steenbergen, asked me, we were visiting Springfield for the annual Abraham Lincoln Association banquet. And we got up early on the morning of February 11th, the day before the banquet and the program, and he asked if I would like to join him in doing a little walk around Springfield. What we decided to do was kind of walk from where Lincoln was living to his residence to the Great Western Depot, trying to mimic the little trip that Lincoln took as he was going to leave for Springfield, which we did. We had a good time. We tried to get there about the time Lincoln would have spoken, right around 8 o'clock a.m. And in doing so, we just talked about all the things that we were seeing as we were walking in Springfield. I made the comment that I thought it seemed like a metaphorical journey through Lincoln's life. There were many things through his life in Springfield that we got to see. And Brian suggested that maybe next time we should ask others if they wanted to join us for our walk and make it an annual thing. So I agreed. I thought it was a great idea. So I started to research and put together a little walking tour that we would do on an annual basis. And in doing so, I suddenly stumbled across all kinds of things that were very new to me, that had been less often published, or maybe not even published at all. So, or maybe contradicted some things that had been published, as the case may be. So I decided to take some of those things and write a larger article. So what this talk tonight is a little bit of a combination. I am still working on completing my manuscript for an article I'm going to write about this. And I'm still working on putting together the tour. So this is going to be a little bit of a mashup between information from the article as well as a little bit of the walking tour. So I hope you'll join me or enjoy as we move along here. So to start out with, I just want to show you this map of downtown Springfield. So this is a map of Springfield, Illinois from 1858. I tried to get one that was close to the time that we're talking about. And just to give a little bit of orientation here, this is the old state capitol. For those of you that have been to Springfield, you know where this is. And down here is, at the bottom there, is the Lincoln home. Everything that we're going to talk about this evening is going to kind of fall right within this geographical area. So next up, this is the old state capitol. Many of you guys, if you visited Springfield, will recognize this. This was taken from the west side of the square. So this is the west face of the old state capitol. Now, starting out with Lincoln in 1860, after he got the election, or actually starting out as soon as he got the nomination, then Governor John Wood who was the lieutenant governor, Henry Bissell, died. John Wood took over. But John Wood, and imagine this is, I find this so strange, decided that he really didn't need to be in Springfield to act as governor. He was going to stay in Quincy. He decided that he did not have any interest in coming to Springfield. He had his own business interests to take care of. And so he added on to his house to make a gubernatorial office in his own home, and kindly decided that perhaps Lincoln should be able to use his office in the old state capitol and for his business as the Republican presidential nominee, which Lincoln did. And it became even more valuable when Lincoln was elected president, and he used this office to visit with dignitaries, lots of people coming to town, meet other visitors, and take care of business. This is the room in the old state capitol on the second floor where the governor's office was and that Lincoln used for his work at that time. And this is how John Nicolay described this particular office. He talks about this image, which I've put in the slideshow here. This is from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. Nicolay says, aside from the fact that it makes it look entirely too large, the actual room measurement being about 15 feet by 25 feet, the view is tolerably correct. And as he is sitting at the desk, you can see in the background is John Nicolay. He mentions, and he's writing this to his girlfriend, I guess, or perhaps fiance, Therina Bates. He says that when getting the image, he sent the image to her, and he says, when getting the image framed, she should not spend too much, not to exceed $75. So apparently Nicolay was quite proud of this image and that he was in it, and they wanted it framed in the house. Now, Lincoln lasted in this office till about the end of December, early January of 1861. When the new governor came in and the new legislative session started, it was time for the new governor to take over the office, and so Lincoln had to find a new place. So you can see up here in the top corner, we're now going to what is called Johnson's Building, which was just about a block off of the north side of the old state capitol square. Joel Johnson was a friend of Abraham Lincoln's. He was a local businessman. He was using what was known as Johnson's Building at the time. He and his family lived on the second floor of the building, and below it was presumably retail space. But during this time, he offered part of his rooms to Mr. Lincoln for use as an office. And again, Mr. Nicolay talked about this particular office. I'm going to give you, here is a picture of the building. A little bit later, it became known as the Revere House Hotel, but is ostensibly the same, what the building looked like at that time, except that it wasn't as far back down 5th Street. Mr. Lincoln, Nicolay says, and again in another letter to Therina Bates, Mr. Lincoln and I moved out of our room at the State House yesterday. He went down to his own house where he will stay most of the time to receive visitors. And I have come to a room in what is called Johnson's Building, just across the street from the Chenery House. It is quite a good room, about 25 feet square, newly painted and papered and carpeted, and pretty well furnished. This I shall occupy both as a bedroom and as an office. I shall be here all the time at work, and Mr. Lincoln will come here occasionally when I need his advice or he my immediate assistance. It is a very comfortable place if I can keep the crowd out during the session. The session being the congressional session. Apparently that was the thing to do, was when all the politicians were in town after their work was done, they would go and bother Mr. Nicolay, or probably more likely try to gain audience with Mr. Lincoln. Edward Johnson, who is the son of Joel Johnson, who owned this building at the time, was a younger boy at that time. He described the building as being by about 100 feet by 45 feet. So you can see the dimensions there, or think about the dimensions as they might have been at that time. I think this drawing is so interesting. It's obviously not to scale. If you look at this little trolley car in the front here is quite tiny. Apparently Munchkins were driving that trolley car toward the Revere House here. So at some point, Mr. Lincoln began, he saw visitors in his house and some in as well at Johnson's Building. But this ad was entered into the paper at the end of January 1861. And he says the present week being the last that Mr. Lincoln remains at Springfield, and it being indispensable that he should have a portion of his time to himself, he will see visitors only at his office, number 4 Johnson's Building, from 3:30 to 5 p.m. each day. And we know Mr. Lincoln saw visitors in the White House, but this was something he started in Springfield. This was not really common practice, but he did take visitors every single day for people that wanted to talk to him. Some dignitaries, some regular people off the street. And there are lots of stories about people coming to see Mr. Lincoln, sometimes just to give him a gift, wish him well as to probably try and gain some plum appointment as well. So this is one of the first things that I found of interest. We knew that Lincoln's office was in number 4 Johnson's building, but we don't really know where exactly that was in Johnson's building, except that it was on the 2nd floor. And in researching my tour, I was looking through a number of online archives, trying to find exactly where Lincoln's office was. And I came across this image. Now, this image is also of the Revere House or Johnson's building, and it was included in a letter that was written by Edward S. Johnson when someone had asked him basically the same question. And this is what he sent to them. Now, this is microfilmed from the original. And you can see here, there's a star and an X, and it says rooms occupied by Mr. Lincoln. This is the south front, which would be along Washington Street. And then there's the entrance to the building was on 4th Street. Now, I don't know how good your eyes are. Mine are pretty good, but I can't see squat in this image. It was microfilm. This happened to be in the collection at the Library of Congress. So I did email my friend Michelle Crowell, who is the manuscripts division coordinator for the 19th century at the Library of Congress. And I asked her if I could possibly see the original for this. Now, oftentimes when documents are microfilm, they don't really allow you to see the original so that it can stay preserved unless there is a case. And she did agree with me that there was a case here. We really can't see what it is we're trying to find. So this was all happening during the pandemic, so it took a little while, but I was able to get a scan of the original. And as Michelle said when she emailed it to me, I think you will be happy. And this is what came back. I got this, was the original document, clearly marked in red. You can see exactly where Mr. Lincoln's offices were. And you can see there was a doorway on 4th Street, and he has an arrow pointed directly to it. And then up on the 2nd floor were these particular offices. So this was something that was very new, something that I have not seen published at this point, exactly where Mr. Lincoln's offices were in Johnson's building. Now that becomes even more interesting. I'm just showing this picture again so you can see a clear picture of this particular building. Next up here, this is a 1938 newspaper article where they were talking about tearing down the Revere House or Johnson's building. So you can see the work was being done. They had torn at least part of this building down in 1938. Now, if you look at the building today, take a look at that. That is Johnson's building. Now look at how the shape of the building is. I'm going to toggle back to what the construction was. And Dick Hart, a local Springfield historian who has just recently passed away, unfortunately, for all of us in the Lincoln community, took a look at this, and it seems that they never finished the demolition of the building, and there is a remnant of Johnson's building that still exists in Springfield. Now, if you look at this, of course, the portion that housed Lincoln's offices is the part that has been demolished for sure. So this is something that I would say it is probable that this is a remnant of Johnson's building that still exists in Springfield. So it's kind of a neat reminiscence of the time and some place that Mr. Lincoln actually could have frequented and certainly walked by. The next building that we're going to talk about is the St. Nicholas Hotel. The St. Nicholas Hotel is about a block north, and you can see that again on the map there I have circled. This is an image of the St. Nicholas Hotel as it would have looked in Mr. Lincoln's time. And the reason that I include the St. Nicholas Hotel is because this is another one of the activities that Mr. Lincoln was involved in during the time, his last time in Lincoln after he was in Springfield after he was elected. Many people came to meet with Lincoln. One was a sculptor by the name of Thomas Jones. Mr. Jones had been commissioned to do a sculpture of Lincoln. He found a room in the St. Nicholas Hotel, which he described as the best and the cleanest house in town. And he talked about, he got to Springfield on about Christmas Day of 1860, and he immediately met with Mr. Lincoln, and he was struck with Mr. Lincoln. Thomas Jones says, quote, "He is the man for the hour, and that includes all that can be said of anyone. He reminds me of a rough block, of the old red primitive sandstone, thoroughly tried by fire and capable of enduring much more. The Union may be divided before he's inaugurated, but he is the political Vulcan that will weld it together again. At least, as far as I have been able to infer from his conversation, his mind is fully made up on that point. He has all the positive qualities of a statesman and soldier combined with the firmness of a Jackson and the clear perception of a Clay. He will be president of 36 states and nothing less. That is his ultimatum. Let demagogues wheedle one another as much as they may. What Lincoln swears to do, he will execute to the full letter of the law and the Constitution." He was obviously very impressed with Mr. Lincoln. And he talks about, I'm going to flip to the next one here. He talks about how it was set up that he would sculpt Lincoln. Jones says, quote, "I was to receive a setting of an hour daily from Mr. Lincoln in the forenoon. It was impossible for him to be regular or punctual. Too many calls on him from all parts of the country." This is an illustration done by Lloyd Ostendorf of Mr. Lincoln being sculpted and modeled by Thomas Jones. And it was interesting. Jones has two existing letters from this time, from the time that existed. I pulled from. He also wrote reminiscence, and he talks about how he would often just discuss the topics of the day with Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln would tell him about who he had met with, what their demands were. Talk about the speeches. He had already begun to write speeches for his inaugural journey. And Jones also described about, and this image sort of is what this image is depicting. He talked about how Lincoln had written parts of his inaugural speech while sitting at the St. Nicholas, often using his crossed legs as a desk, as he would read open mail, write. Jones also described how Mr. Lincoln became more and more despondent as the time of the inauguration got closer, just because of the things that were happening politically and how the southern states had decided to secede and so on. It was a very busy, stressful time. Jones described Lincoln as being, how do you say it, by far the most difficult subject I have ever encountered. He described his face as careworn, or rather thought-worn, he said, hard, liney, and nothing in repose. But when Lincoln was told a good story or anecdote, his face would come alive. It was that image of Mr. Lincoln that Jones had endeavored to capture. So I have with you, and Jones took a long time to finish his sculpture. When Lincoln left in February of 1861, he had not yet completed his bust. It took until, I believe, March or longer of March, or even into June or July, for him to finish it. And this is an example of the final product. This is one of the many copies. It's frankly not that great of a copy, but this was the image that he produced of Lincoln. The primary image being in the State House in Columbus, Ohio, is where the one he actually commissioned in marble and is currently displayed now. So as we move along, this is the site now where the St. Nicholas Hotel was. It is now the Nick, which is like a hotel, or excuse me, a apartment building, and there's a restaurant and bar down below here. The next thing we're going to move to is the Chenery House Hotel. Again, you can see all of this is sort of up in this corner of this same area as we begin. This is where we started our tour. When Brian and I decided to start with our tour, we decided we were going to start at the Chenery House, as that's where Lincoln lived during his last days in Springfield. A lot of people don't realize that. They actually moved out of their house and rented it out. This is, of course, an image of the Lincoln home. On January 31st, appearing in the Illinois State Journal, this advertisement was placed. At private sale, the furniture consisting of parlor and chamber sets, carpets, sofas, chairs, wardrobes, bureaus, bedsteads, stoves, china, queensware, glass, etc., at the residence on the corner of 8th and Jackson Street. It is offered at private sale without reserve. For particulars, apply to the premises at once. The Lincolns had decided to not only rent their home, but to sell much of their goods. And we do have records of the fact that some of the people who bought the Lincoln's items, which actually gives a good idea of what was actually in the Lincoln home at the time. and the Lincolns sold some of their items. Lucian Tilton, who was the president of the Great Western Railroad at the time, was the person who rented Mr. Lincoln's home, and he also purchased some of the furniture. The rent was $350 per year, so not a bad deal at that time. I wish I could get my rent for that, but I can't. A lot of the furnishings that were in that time that were sold, some of them have been recovered and brought back to the Lincoln home. Others were taken with various people and actually burned up in the Great Chicago Fire. Mr. Tilton lost a lot of things, as did Samuel H. Melvin, who bought, we have a record that bought some of Mr. Lincoln's other possessions as well. It was at this point they also had burned a lot of their correspondence, a lot of papers, and Mary would burn them. They were burning in a barrel in the backyard, and some of the neighbors came, and that's how some of these correspondence survives. They would just ask Mr. Lincoln for souvenirs, which he handed them, just personal papers, to get his autograph, and some of those do survive today. So where they moved to was this building, which was the Chenery House as it looked in 1861. And this is an interesting, this is again another one of the things that I found when I was looking through this that I hadn't really seen or understood clearly before. We did know that Lincoln moved to the Chenery House on February 8th, before he left on February 11th. So there was about 4 or 5 days where they had moved into this building. And we knew that they lived on the second floor well in that building, but not exactly where. The hotel was owned by William Dodd Chenery and his son, John William Chenery. They were the proprietors. They had previously managed the American House Hotel, which was, again, just off the square in downtown Springfield. And they purchased this place in 1855. And this is a newspaper article that talks about the Chenery House that I found in February 12th, 1918. And in the article itself, it says, Mr. Lincoln occupied the rooms marked by the X's. Now, again, if you can look at this and see the X's, your eyes are better than mine, because I could not find them in here anywhere. But at the same time, it was in the article, so I knew it had to be there. Well, again, when perusing the same record groups at the Library of Congress, I found this image. Essentially the same image, but if you look on the left on the second floor, facing toward 5th Street, you can see 2 X's just below 2 windows with the shutters open. And those are the rooms that were occupied by Mr. Lincoln. Now, the other thing that came about, I'm going to kind of flip here. We're going to go back to this picture because I think it's a little bit better picture. And you can see that the shutters are open, those second ones on there. The other thing that I found when doing this was that there was a letter by William Dodd Chenery II, who was the son of John William Chenery and the grandson of William Dodd Chenery I, who owned this. And he writes a letter and says, the omnibus pictured here in the front there, the one that had it sort of backed up to the hotel there, so the one on the right of the 2 carriages you see there, was the one that took Mr. Lincoln to the Great Western Depot the morning he left for Springfield. Also, that morning, Mr. Lincoln, and this is the famous story that we all know, Mr. Lincoln took a bunch of cards from the Chenery House and on the back wrote, A. Lincoln, White House, Washington, D.C. He lashed his own trunks up with rope and then attached those to each of the trunks. At the same time, he was asked by William Dodd Chenery if he could autograph a card for his daughter, known as Fanny. And I did find a picture of Fanny Chenery. This is what she looked like. She had asked personally for an autograph from Mr. Lincoln, which of course he granted her. He took one of the Chenery House cards and he wrote his name on the back. This was a treasured possession of Fanny Chenery. She had it in her possession until she died, at which point she willed it to her nephew, named John Abraham Lincoln Chenery. And I found his obituary, and it said that he maintained that until the time of his death, and it was his most prized possession. And that was in 1948. At that time, I have been unable to track where that little calling card is that had Lincoln's address on the back. So if anybody out there knows anything about it, I would love to find that and take a photograph of it. I think it would be a really neat reminiscence or a neat piece. So if my friend Dan Weinberg is out there, proprietor of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, I would love to know if you've seen that anywhere out there, or if anyone else might know of its whereabouts today. This is the site of the Chenery House today. In about 1902, it was torn down, and the Illinois Hotel was built on this site. And this is that same building. It was later converted to office space, and that is primarily, as far as I know, what it is used for today. So the next thing we're going to talk about is sort of this idea of, I always call it from the Chenery House to the depot. Now, this is one of the other things that in conducting my research, this question comes up of who it was that drove Mr. Lincoln from the Chenery House to the depot. The name most commonly associated with this, and I see it in books all over the place, is an African-American Springfielder by the name of Jamison Jenkins. Jamison Jenkins was a drayman. He was basically had a wagon. He carted things around for people, is what a drayman was. And he lived in Mr. Lincoln's neighborhood. However, there are at least 3 or 4 other people's names who have been associated with this event of taking Mr. Lincoln to the depot, all of which seem to have some sort of claim on having been the one that drove Mr. Lincoln. And I can tell you, I am currently still tracing down some of the research threads on this, so I'm not going to get more specific, so my apologies. But what I will tell you is I have been unable to find one iota of primary source reference or documentation that supports that Jamison Jenkins was the person who drove Lincoln to the depot. And I know that's going to be disappointing for some people. And one of the candidates does seem to have some good supporting evidence. No smoking gun, but some good circumstantial evidence. And I am still trying to track down some other research threads with respect to that. And that is one of the things that's sort of been delaying my finishing of the article, is I want to make sure I track all those down and either rule in or rule out some of the evidence with support to that. So this is the little map. We don't actually know the route that Lincoln took from the Chenery House to the Great Western Depot. But this is sort of the route that I would probably suspect that he took, because it's the easiest one. He's backed up to the Chenery House there at the top. He came down the street, turned right onto 5th Street, and then made a left on Monroe Street, which would be a straight shot toward the depot that you can see down there at the end. And this is where I was talking about, where he would have taken somewhat of a metaphorical journey through his days in Springfield. So what we're going to do now is kind of imagine that Mr. Lincoln was taking this trip, and we're going to follow this route a little bit to the Great Western Depot. So the first thing we're going to see here, this is across 5th Street on the west side of 5th Street. This was a photo taken in 1859, and we can see sort of what that side of the street looked like. Now, you can see, I don't know, Heather, maybe you can help me. I don't think I have a pointer here. So I'm going to talk about this, and I hope you guys can follow along with my description here. On the left side of the image, you see sort of these lower slung 2-story buildings. And then as you move down toward the right or to the north side of the square, you can see sort of taller buildings. In 1853, the half of the taller buildings had burned down. There was a fire on this side of the square. At the time, they called it one of the worst fires that had ever stricken Springfield. So probably if we look at the left side of the square, those were buildings reminiscent of what the square would have looked like in the early 1850s. And then they put new buildings up on the right side. Now, you can also see in the very center of the photograph, on the side of that one building, you see G.W. Chatterton, dealer in watches, jewelry, silverware, etc. Now, on that site was the original Chatterton's building, which is where Lincoln bought his wedding ring for Mary. Now, that building did burn in 1855. It had survived a previous fire in 1853, but did survive this. And so there's that building. If you go to the far end of the square there as well, again, on the corner, hard to see, and I apologize, I don't have a pointer here. On that very end building would have been the site of where Joshua Speed's store was. So when Lincoln first came to Springfield, famously walked in, said he was looking for a room. Joshua Speed, being a storekeeper, invited Lincoln to share a room with him. And Lincoln took his bag, walked upstairs, set it down, came back and said, "There it is, Speed, I moved in." That was basically all the possessions he had. And then just to the south of that building, and the one that we can see here, again, that original building would have burned in 1855. But just next to that building, we can see would have been where the Lincoln Herndon Law Office was. the last Lincoln Herndon Law Office. Here's more of a close-up of that particular building. You can see right in the center there where it says he lives in the hearts of the people. That is the building. On the second floor of that building, I think toward the back, looking more out of the alley, was where Lincoln and Herndon had their final law office. Now, this is one of the things, too, that Herndon reports, that on the day before Lincoln left, so on February 10th, 1865, Lincoln had visited Herndon here at their law office to wrap up some of their business that they had, talk about the ongoing cases, and talk a little bit maybe about plans that Lincoln had after the presidency. Lincoln had said that it was his intention to come back. There are some reports that say that Mary did not want to come back to Springfield. So there is some conflicting reports there. But Lincoln did ask Herndon, according to Herndon's account, to leave the Lincoln and Herndon sign out front and just leave it where it is. He did intend to come back. Now, this image is from, it's been dated to 1881. At first, it seemed like they thought that probably this was from when Lincoln had died in 1865. But some more investigation by James Cornelius when he was at the ALPL, the Abraham Lincoln Library, Presidential Library, determined by looking at some city directories that it was probably with the Miller building there, was probably in 1881. And this bunting, and he lives in the hearts of the people, was probably for James Garfield when another presidential assassination. So this is the only photo that I know of that has that Lincoln and Herndon Law Office. This was not one that I was familiar with. It had been published, was not one that I had been familiar with before doing the research for this particular tour and then article. This is a more current image of what it looks like now. This is the building. Obviously, progress moves forward. That building was torn down. I'm not exactly sure when, and this is the building now that has replaced it. And you can see, if you look closely, just off the street on the sidewalk, again, I wish I had a pointer, but there is a Looking for Lincoln tablet right on the front of that building that gives a wonderful description of both of Speed's store and of the Lincoln Herndon Law Office. So kudos to Looking for Lincoln for doing a wonderful job of keeping that local Springfield history alive, as well as throughout the Looking for Lincoln Heritage Coalition area. And then I just put this up again. We're going to revisit this Chatterton's building again. And as I move on to the next one, that building actually does still exist. The Chatterton building, as it was after the 1855 fire, is there. This is a photo that I took very recently on my last trip to Springfield. But this building is interesting in a couple of other ways as well. Like I said, on that site was the place where Lincoln bought Mary the wedding room, but on the second floor of that, in the front, was where the office of James C. Conkling was. So the law office of James Conkling, to whom Lincoln addressed the famous Conkling letter, was his law office. And there are some reports that Lincoln visited that office on the morning he found out he got the nomination for president, as he was trying to, probably he was nervous, trying to go around, visit, ask if James Conkling was back yet. He was not. He was still on his way back to Chicago. He talked with one of the other junior law partners or interns there at the time. The other interesting thing about this particular building is that on the third floor of this building was the Christopher German photography studio. And it was in that building that Lincoln had these photos taken. And all three of these images were taken during Lincoln's final days in Springfield. So the top one being on January 13th, 1861, and the bottom two being on February 9th, 1861. We can see certainly Lincoln's beard has filled out a lot more as he had started it, we know, in probably late November, early December of 1860, and he continued to grow. As you can see, the bottom image here on the right, this sort of Lincoln in profile, this is always considered one of the ones, and again, those of you that are watching that are Lincoln people, get excited about this stuff, as crazy as it is to other people. This is one of the images where we actually get to see the side and the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Almost in no other image. There's one other profile that we get a little bit of that, but very rarely do we get to see that. And we can see his very full head of hair. And for those of you that kind of have seen the images of Abraham Lincoln and how he ages during the course of the presidency, you can really see how much younger he looks in these photos. And Thomas Jones talked about this particular image, and when he was sculpting, talked about how Lincoln had such a wonderful full head of hair until Washington barbers got a hold of him. So we can say there was certainly an aging process going on, but Thomas Jones obviously did not think much of the barbers in Washington, D.C. either, and how they massacred Abraham Lincoln's fine, full head of hair and his whiskers too. So the next thing, I'm just going to revisit this a little bit so we can see this image. And as we turn left down Monroe Street, on that corner of Monroe and Fifth, and I don't have an image of this because one does not exist, that was supposedly where the famous jumping scrape occurred. So in the Illinois legislature, when Lincoln was in that in about 1840, in order to kind of stall a Democratic vote to maybe not get a quorum, Lincoln and at least one other member of the Republican Party, or the Whig Party, as it was then, jumped out of a window so as not to get a quorum. And that's where that occurred, was on that corner. There is also a Looking for Lincoln placard there as well. That was something that was very embarrassing to Mr. Lincoln, and he never liked to talk about that afterward. But I do like the idea of him passing by that when he left Springfield as just one of the things that occurred during his political career in that time. As Lincoln drove down Monroe Street, I did look this up at one time just to get an idea of what was on that street as he would have been going down the street. It was a mix of residential residences and then businesses as well. In one place down near about 9th Street, Curtis Mann at the Lincoln Library helped me as we were looking at this, and we found that one of the businesses was actually a business owned by a woman, a widowed woman, which I love the idea of that back in that time. There were women who owned businesses as well, and I believe she had a boarding house was what she had at that time. And so Mr. Lincoln would have passed by that as well. The every day-to-day business of Springfielders as he was leaving town. Our next slide, as we're sort of arriving here at the Great Western Depot. This is much as it would have looked in 1861 when Lincoln left. And for those of you that know Springfield know that this is not what it looks like now. This was a one-story building. And again, we can see some of these low-slung businesses that were around there at the time. This is an image, a more contemporary image of what it looks like now. For those that have visited recently, that building just on the other side of the depot has been demolished. It's an open area, and there is tons of construction around this area. So I did choose this picture because it was a little bit less cluttered. From an image standpoint, the depot is obviously in the exact same place, and that building is gone. There was an unfinished mural on that side as well. And we're going to move on here to, again, just to view the depot, just to put it in your head, because I want you to think about the depot and how the track runs just on the other side of the depot. So these are a group of images here that we often see of Mr. Lincoln giving his farewell address. And you can see some of them are probably a bit fanciful, some of them maybe not so fanciful. But the three that I want to focus on here is these three. And there's a reason that I want to focus on these. If you look on the right-hand side of each of those images, you can see sort of the overhang, the passenger area for the depot. So every one of these seems to show the train going right up against the depot, which means the train would have been facing south. But this always confused me. And this was something that when Brian and I did our walkthrough of our tour, we were a little bit confused by, because again, this would mean the train was facing south. But we knew that the Great Western Rail Line left to the north. So we knew these images had to have been incorrect. And this particular images, this couldn't have been correct. They wouldn't have pulled around, done a U-turn on a train and headed back north. So as we were talking about this, we were trying to figure that out, something we were going to research. So the other question we had was, where did all the people stand when they were listening to Lincoln's talk? Well, as I was researching, I did come across a couple accounts that address this issue. I later found out one of them had been published, or both of them had been published, but they were not that well known. And this was an account given by Louis Zumbrook, and he was there that day. Most of the people recorded what Lincoln said or described the day, but nobody really talked about the scene. And Zumbrook says, the last time I saw him, he was standing on the rear end of a passenger car on the north side of Monroe Street in front of the old Wabash Passenger Depot, bidding us his final Farewell. I remember yet his little address. So right away, my impression had always been, and it was based totally on these drawings, was that the train was on the south side of Monroe Street next to the passenger depot, when it was in fact on the north side of Monroe Street, which makes a lot more sense as far as the train leaving toward the north. But it also meant the depot wasn't there. Well, Louis Zumbrook expanded on this account later in a letter that was sent to Jesse Weick as he was working on his biography. And this was an account taken down by Clinton Conkling, who was a friend of Robert Lincoln and the son of James C. Conkling. And he did a lot of work. And I found lots of good stuff in the Conkling papers at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and a lot of his correspondence that kind of shed a lot of light on this stuff and really changed my thoughts on this. And Zumbrook says, it was a chilly morning and a drizzling rain was falling. I was there some minutes, perhaps 10 minutes before Mr. Lincoln spoke. He came out onto the rear of the platform about 10 feet from the sidewalk and talked to the crowd, which numbered perhaps 1 and 200. Now notice what his account says, 1 to 200. In the Nicolay and Hay version of the biography, they said there was at least 1,000 people out there. Now, if you can imagine, for those that have been there, 1,000 people out there, that would have been massive. Other accounts I have seen place the number at about 500, which probably is a little bit more accurate. But again, Zumbrook says 1 to 200 people, which he says there were not very many, which is not what we like to believe about this scene, but this is a particular account. He continues, I heard his address from beginning to end. After he had finished, the train moved north on the stub side track. So it was not on the main track either. There was a stub side track that it had moved off onto, and thence to the main track and disappeared without stopping. I was told by the people that were there before him, the train was first on the main track, but they had switched to the stub side track so he could speak to the people as they stood on Monroe Street, and without their standing on the main track, because some thought that would be safer. He continues, I didn't see the train go up the main track then and come back. It was already there when he arrived. Now, this kind of changes the idea, too. Lincoln had told Herndon the day before that he didn't think there was really any need for him to make any remarks as he left. Something must have changed his mind. Perhaps it was his well-wishers there that asked him to make some remarks. And so they moved the train up onto that side stub track because they knew people would be gathering there. So we always talk about Lincoln having made these remarks purely impromptu, which is really not the case. It was impromptu in the sense that he didn't write his written remarks, which he often did and liked to do before he spoke at all. So his remarks were impromptu, but I think the idea that he would speak was maybe a little bit beforehand. And I do want to give you, I'm going to continue with this first. I want to give you a couple other accounts. This is from Clinton Conkling, who was also there that day. It reminds me of Mr. Lincoln. He's writing this letter to his son. It reminds me of Mr. Lincoln's departure yesterday from this place. He obviously was writing it on February 12th. It was quite affecting. Many eyes were filled to overflowing as Mr. Lincoln uttered those few and simple words which you will see in the papers. His own breast heaved with emotion, and he could scarcely command his feelings sufficiently to continue. God bless him and preserve him and nerve him for the terrible struggles and dangers which he may be called upon to meet and endure. Now, the next image I'm going to show you, again, is this map of Springfield. And what I wanted to point out is I'm going to see if I did, no, is close up. Zumbrook in his account did talk about that stub track, and Conkling, you can see, doesn't mention it. He mentions his words. If you go to the far bottom right corner of this map, you can see the Great Western Depot. And if you look closely, you can see that there was, in fact, a stub track that went off to the side. Okay. The next image I'm going to show was an image drawn by Clinton Conkling based on Zumbrook's account and the city directories and everything else. And as we look here, we can see not only, and this is something I'd never seen published before. The account had been published, but here is the map. If you look at the top of the map, you can see where the the stub side track was, and you can see an X drawn right there. That was the spot where the train car was that Mr. Lincoln spoke from. Just to the south of the street and a little to the left, you can see where the railroad station was. And the thing that I loved about this was Conkling, and it's hard to see here, but he did write, there's a little arrow just at the front right corner of the railroad station, and he writes from that corner 80 feet to the corner of the building. That gives us an idea of it was almost exactly where Mr. Lincoln spoke. So as I advance this is a view of where it was. And if you look, there's a little sign just to the left of the railroad track. If you go across that little rocky way, there's a little sign there, like a fire lane or no parking. If you come just to the right of that, about where that little mound of rocks are, or a little to the right, is approximately where Lincoln was standing. However high the train platform car was, that is where Lincoln was standing when he delivered his farewell address. And so lastly, we get to the farewell address. Now, I put these two images in here. The one on the left is what was recorded in the newspaper that morning. And to the right is what was sort of the account as far as it was written out, what Lincoln's words were. After he spoke, the newspaper reporters asked him to write out his words. They thought the speech was so moving that they wanted him to write it. But as Mr. Lincoln did on occasion, he refined the speech in his dictation. You can see it starts out in Lincoln's handwriting, and it's all wobbly. Then it becomes John Nicolay's handwriting, which is also wobbly. Then it goes back to Mr. Lincoln's handwriting. I'm just going to make a little point here on another project I'm working on. If anyone thinks that Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on a train, all you have to do is look at this to see how hard it is to write on a moving train in the 1860s. Now, there are some differences between these two speeches. We don't really have time to go into that. We can answer some questions if you'd like about that as we wrap up. So as I'm going to finish there, I'm going to leave that account up, and then I'm going to kind of make some final comment. This is Thomas Jones's words as he wrapped up his account of what happened. He says, "It was a dark, gloomy, misty morning, boding rain. The people assembled early to say their last goodbyes to the man they loved so much. The railroad office was used as a reception room. Lincoln took a position where his friends and neighbors could file by in a line. As they came up, each one took his hand in silence. The tearful eye, the tremulous lips, and inaudible words was a scene never to be forgotten. When the crowd passed him, I stepped up to say goodbye. He gave me both his hands. No words after that. The train that was to bear him away, and Lincoln mounted the rear platform of one of the cars. Just at that moment, Mrs. Lincoln's carriage drove up. It was raining. I proffered my umbrella and arm. We approached Lincoln as near as we could for the crowd and heard the last and best speech ever delivered in Springfield." Thank you all very much for your attention to this talk that I gave. I hope you learned a few new things as I did while studying for this tour. Some interesting things that I hadn't found out about I hadn't found out about until I did this. Obviously, my article, when I finish it, is going to have more detail on some of these things than the time allotted that we had here. And I did really want to stay on time. The last thing I'll leave you with here, you can snap a photo of this if you're watching on your computer. This is just some recommended reading about Lincoln's last days in Springfield. There's a couple books there that are very specifically about Lincoln as president-elect. Looking for Lincoln in Illinois, part of the publishing that was supported by the Looking for Lincoln Project by Brian C. Andreasen in 2015, is a great little book about Lincoln in Springfield and looking at the many different sites. Lincoln's Sword by Douglas Wilson talks a little bit about the final speech, and Abraham Lincoln and others at the St. Nicholas talks about the St. Nicholas Hotel, and then Thomas Jones having sculpted him there. And then I put a couple biographies in there. They're much larger biographies, but both of them do address this issue as well. Okay. So lastly, I'm going to end with just an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. And we can go into a little bit more detail perhaps in questions that you might have, both about what we talked about here in the presentation, as well as any other questions that maybe I can help you answer about Lincoln's last days in Springfield.
Hi, Scott. Thank you
Hey,
so
Heather.
very much. That was very informative.
Good. I apologize, too, for sort of leaving out the big question everybody wants to know is who really drove Lincoln to the depot?
Well, they'll have to wait for your article.
Yeah, well, yeah. I would love to have shared it here, but I mentioned to you before, and some of the others that may be watching know, I just have a couple other little research threads I want to track down and make sure I have my ducks in a row before maybe change the narrative a little bit on who drove Lincoln to the depot.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. So I want to know about the differences between the two farewell addresses, because I know you were trying to keep close on time. So could you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, there are very subtle differences, and it's just a little bit about his language. There's always the question of, and can we put that back up to answer the question or not really? Because I can just kind of read through a little bit. There's a couple lines that change just a little bit, and I'm going to go through here. And so he talks about things. Just the last line is a little bit different. To you, dear friends, I owe all that I have, all that I am. All those strange checkered past seems to crowd upon my mind. Those are just a little bit different wording. Today I leave you, and this is sort of one of the famous passages. He words a little different. I go to assume a task more difficult than that which devolved upon General Washington. Unless the great God who assisted him shall be with and aid me, I must fail. That's just a little bit different word construction than he used in the final draft. And his last line is also a little bit different. With these few words, I must leave you. For how long, I know not. Friends, one and all, I must now bid you an affectionate farewell. And he does use that same line, I bid you an affectionate farewell, as the last line that he uses with the other. But he just changes that construction. It's hard to read on this copy that I have here what he actually said. And I have a book over here. I can dig it out.
It's fine.
But the idea is, and I like this, the idea is that there are some that have the idea. There was one book that's related to another project that I'm working on that I won't go into great detail. But this particular author, in talking about the Gettysburg Address or other issues, says Lincoln, who never revised his speeches during his time, something he never did. And I'm like, he did it right when he became president and took off. The very last Springfield speech he gave, he understood posterity. He understood the times that he was living in, the times that he would be president over. He worked to make sure that the language was refined. And when it was going to be in the newspaper, he wanted it to be a more definitive version, which some of you may know he did with the Gettysburg Address. There are 5 known copies of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in his own handwriting, all of which differ from each other and from what the newspaper accounts do. So Lincoln was adamant about making sure that it was his words in the way he wanted them remembered that were published.
Okay. So here's my next question.
Yeah.
What do you, and this is going to be really hard, I know, for you, Scott, but what do you think is the most interesting thing that you learned when you were researching his last final days?
It's without a doubt, it's the person that I think that drove Lincoln to the depot. And you can always look at, it's not, is it really a significant fact who drove Lincoln to the depot? Maybe, maybe not. But the way that it's currently interpreted makes things important for various reasons. Jameson Jenkins was an African American who lived in Lincoln's neighborhood. And he has been the one that has been most connected. And I will tell you, several of the other candidates for who drove him are also people of color. And so the narrative becomes, it's used to help describe Lincoln's relationship with the African American community in Springfield at that time. So determining who it was does play a role in how we interpret that. And that's one side. The other side of that is it was important to the people or the person, whoever it may have been, who did drive Lincoln to the depot. That was something that was very important to them until the end of their life. And we have some information about that. And we know everybody wanted to associate themselves with Lincoln. And that was just another way one of the community members in Springfield could associate with Lincoln in his last days in Springfield. And I think the second one of that, and it was where Lincoln's office was in Johnson's building.
Where it was discovered.
Where it actually was, because that was a total accident. When I was looking on online record groups, I was just clicking on every picture to see what it was. And I was like, what? It actually tells me exactly where it was. And I knew Dick Hart had postulated that part of Johnson's buildings remained. I was really hopeful that the part remained was the part that Lincoln had his offices in, but that ended up not being the case.
Alas, that wasn't true.
Yeah, right. And of course, the third thing, I love the idea I could go stand almost exactly where Lincoln stood to deliver his address. We had 80 feet from the corner of that building. We could kind of step it off because the building still exists just as it did then. And that was fun for me. And that was something that I had always thought it was on the south side, heading the other direction. And it was on the north side, and we know exactly where it was. So those are all interesting things to me. But the number one thing, was, as I mentioned.
Well, I think one of the really interesting things of what you did, it's that line between fact and lore that so often skews history, where,
Absolutely.
okay, this is what people have said forever, but have we actually looked into what actually happened and double checked it? So I think that is an interesting thing of you talking, like you look at that and you're like, oh, right, he's right next to the Great Western Depot. This is where Lincoln left from. And
yep.
No.
And I think that's the impression most people have when they go visit.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we're necessarily doing people a disservice because nobody really articulates that. But at the same time, you can turn around and actually stand on the spot. Christopher Oakley, a historian at University of North Carolina, Asheville, just recently released his research of where Lincoln was standing at the Gettysburg Address when he delivered the Gettysburg Address using 21st century technology. And the National Park Service says the number one question they are asked, where did Lincoln stand when he delivered his Gettysburg Address? Well, you know what? Springfield should have that too. Where was Lincoln when he delivered his farewell speech?
I'm not sure the farewell speech is up there with Gettysburg.
Yes, well, it is one of my favorite of his addresses. Probably it is one of my favorite ones of his. It's not as well known, certainly. But I will also say thank you for mentioning about that, finding and taking things back to the primary source. That is something that I always really work hard on. And I have found so many things that are really not corroborated. And in some cases, not only are they not corroborated, there is a different answer that's actually out there. So that's in the work that I'm doing in my practice of history. I do a lot of that. And my next project after this one, if people are upset by the fact that Jameson Jenkins perhaps did not drive Lincoln to the Great Western Depot, there's going to be some people that are really upset about the research I've done on another topic.
Well, we'll have to stay tuned for that. So we always end by asking our guests one question, Scott. And I'm sure you've heard me ask this before because I know you watch our program. So why do you think it's important, as a person yourself, is studying Abraham Lincoln's life and times in the 21st century?
I think Lincoln has still a lot to tell us about his, how do I want to say it? He was a very pragmatic but humble man who rose to great office. He was ambitious. He was a politician. But at the same time, I think it's perfectly exemplified by something I mentioned in my talk. He still took visitors every day. The common man. He never forgot about the common person and that they should be involved in our government. As he later said, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Lincoln never forgot that. And one of the things I think also along with them that makes him interesting to study, David Carroll, he has done some work on Lincoln in photographs, and he was a student of Richard Avedon. Richard Avedon was a famous portrait photographer. And David and I and some others were at a conference one time, and he mentioned how Richard Avedon had said, every great work of art has an element of ambiguity in it. And that's why it appeals to each successive generation, because each generation can see something in that work of art. And I see Mr. Lincoln as much the same way as a person. We really are left with so little of him. He didn't write a diary. We don't have a lot of his personal letters. We're left with what he wrote in his speeches, what he left us as a public, as Americans, as citizens. And I think he's unendingly interesting because of that. And as Herndon called him, the most shut-mouthed man he'd ever known. But he's still interesting. And there are still things to learn. That's what's so wonderful. And hopefully we can continue to learn from him as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Scott. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. And without any further ado, we will end it for this evening. And we will be back next month with another exciting program. So make sure you tune in next time. Good evening.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.